He was sent to guard the dead, but when the tomb awoke, it spoke his name. Now the captain who defied a king must choose between his duty and the bride buried for truth. Long ago, beneath storm clouds that never broke, a bride was sealed in stone. Her name was Seliora, daughter of kings, her beauty sung across the realm. On the night she was to be wed, betrayal crept into her chamber. Instead of vows, iron doors closed around her. Instead of a crown, she was given a tomb. Some said she was cursed. Others whispered she was sacrificed to guard a relic too dangerous for mortal hands. But as the centuries turned, her name faded into dust, remembered only as a warning. Disturb not the bride of the crypt, lest her sorrow wake the stones. The great hall burned with cold fire. Torches jittered in their sconces and cast a fever of light on walls older than the crown itself. In the long hush between proclamations, the breath of the court came like a tide, drawn in, held, and let out in a soft rustle of silk and the faint ring of metal as guards shifted their weight. Eryndor stood alone at the center of the flagstones, where a mosaic of wolves and lilies had been worn to ghost shapes by centuries of boots. His armor was clean but battered, the notches and scuffs speaking of years on the border roads. A crimson sash lay across his chest, frayed, not replaced, because a captain who fought beside his men often left the tailor waiting. He did not bow. He knelt only to the kingdom, and the kingdom was not the same thing as the throne. From the dais, the king's advisors leaned like vultures toward meat. The Lord Treasurer's rings clicked as he folded pale fingers. The Master of Whisperers wore no rings, and nothing that jingled. His eyes did not move, and yet Eryndor felt watched from every angle. A handful of courtiers had come to see the spectacle, drawn by the rumor that the Lion of the North, captain of the city guard, had roared where one should never roar. The king's voice cut the hall. "You have been given much latitude, Captain." "I have taken none that my oath did not require," Eryndor said. His words came measured, iron under velvet. "Your people are hungry. Your collectors grow fat. Petitions are intercepted, and the wrong men are jailed for the right bribes. I set my men to protect market roads, and the caravans are still ambushed, yet those who arrange it feast at your tables." A murmur rose, a shocked little wave that lapped the steps of the throne. The Lord Treasurer's smile was all sugar. "You overstep the boundary of your station." "My station," Eryndor said, "is wherever harm is being done to those who cannot swing a sword in their own defense." The king shifted, bored of euphemisms. He was not a cruel man in visage. Cruelty rarely advertises. He had the tidy calm of administrators and bookkeepers, like a ledger balanced at day's end. "You cast allegations you cannot prove. I can bring proof if I'm allowed to gather it." "And by whose authority?" The king's brows ticked up. "Yours?" "By the authority of a sworn captain who still believes a guard's oath means something." Silence struck like a bell. It rang for several heartbeats. At last the king leaned forward, hands resting lightly on the arms of his chair. "You mistake yourself for an arbiter, Eryndor. The realm has arbiters. It has laws. It has the council. Your duty is to watch gates and keep order in the streets, not to sniff about corridors meant for wiser dogs." The Master of Whisperers tilted his head. "If a hound bites, Your Majesty, you may muzzle it." "Or kennel it," murmured the treasurer. The king's eyes returned to Eryndor. "Your concern for the people is noted. Your insolence is not forgiven." He did not thunder. He did not rage. He spoke with that same ledger voice, and it was somehow worse. "You are relieved of command," the king said. "Your sash, your post, and your men are forfeit to the crown. From this night until it pleases me otherwise, you will take up a watch that requires neither wit nor opinion." Eryndor felt the floor tilt, though his body did not move. "The forgotten tomb," the king said, and the court exhaled as if they had all drunk at once from the same cup. "The crypt at the old sea fortress. You will keep it alone. A captain who wishes to guard truth may learn to guard a stone." Laughter bubbled. careful laughter, the kind that tastes of fear. Eryndor did not look toward the sound. He looked at the king and saw the neatness of the judgment, not death, not exile, not a spectacle to inflame the city's sympathy, a burial in duty, a stillness where a man like him would rust. "Do you understand your sentence?" asked the king. "I understand that you would rather silence a bell than listen to it," Eryndor said, and that was the edge of his boldness. He bowed his head once, no groveling, only acknowledgement. "I will keep what you command me to keep." "Excellent," said the master of whisperers, as if they had concluded a trade. "The dead are rarely troublesome." Eryndor turned then, and as he did, his gaze brushed the gallery where the city's lesser nobles stood. Some looked away, ashamed to be caught enjoying the sight. A few, very few, met his eyes with a brief, helpless solidarity. He carried those looks with him as he walked out beneath the high doors, past his men who no longer were his, past the sun glittering on spearheads in the yard. By evening, they had stripped his office. A sergeant he had trained would not meet his eye. The man had children. Eryndor left with his sword, his cloak, and a small pack of ordinary things. Honor travels light. The road to the sea fortress ran down out of the city like a line of ink drawn toward a smudged horizon. Winter storms had chewed the edges of the way, salt weeds clawed at the ruts, and gulls wheeled above the cliffs with the harsh laughter of scavengers unbothered by kings. 2 riders escorted him as far as the headland. "Orders say we're not to linger, Captain," one said, and then seemed to recall too late that the word no longer applied. "Then ride," Eryndor answered. He was not cruel, he was done being corrected. They left as if a curse might leap the distance between them if they tarried. Their horses pounded back along the ridge, and the last of the city's noise went with them. What remained was wind. The fortress had once been a tooth against the sea. Time had ground it down until it looked like a broken molar, stubborn in a jaw that no longer cared to chew. Tumbled battlements clung to the cliff. The outer gates lay rusted in their sockets. Through an archery slit, Eryndor glimpsed the narrow thread of ocean below, gray as blade metal. The crypt lay in the lower keep, carved into the cliffside where ancient stone kept colder counsel than the halls above. He found the entry by way of a stair that knifed steeply down, the steps worn to troughs by men whose names were all forgotten. As he descended, the air changed. It thickened, cooled, quieted. The world above put away like a closed book. At the bottom, a door waited, bound oak, painted once with lilies and now with the mute green of age. The lock was a heavy thing that looked as if it had been forged to rebuke meddling hands. Eryndor lifted the ring of keys that had been pressed on him and fitted the thickest tooth. Metal growled. The door gave like a breath nobody had dared release. He raised a lantern and went in. The first chamber welcomed him with the smell of old stone, beeswax, and the faint sweetness of something that might once have been flowers. Alcoves bit into the walls. In them lay the anonymous bones of retainers who had served a house long turned to dust. Beyond, an arch opened into the tomb proper, a rondeau of carved pillars enclosing a sarcophagus set like an altar at the center. The lantern's light licked over murals that ringed the chamber. They told a story in stone and pigment cracked with age, a princess standing at a balcony, a city's rooftops like waves beneath her, a procession of torchlight moving through a night of rain, a set of iron doors closing, and the figure of the bride turned inward, hands lifted, not in prayer, Eryndor thought, but in protest. In the final panel, lilies grew from stone as if stone could flower. He drew closer until the flame trembled in the glass. The carver who had given her face had known how to suggest motion in the delicate angle of a mouth. He had known sorrow, too, and the kind of dignity that survives it. Seliora, Eryndor read from the inscription beneath, letters soft as petals. The name moved in his mouth like a word one thinks one has heard before. in a half-remembered song. Duty set his feet. He walked the walls twice, tested the bars on the narrow vents that tasted the sea air, checked the perimeter of the sarcophagus where lead seals glimmered dull in lantern glow. He found the side niche where a watchman's stool waited, and a shelf where candles and oil had been kept in casks. Whoever had last held this post had done it well. The shelves were neat, the wick cutters sharp. A book lay there too, wrapped in oiled cloth, the record of the watch. He opened it and found a hand different from his own. Thin, precise letters marching without flourish. Night counted, moon waning, sea heavy, no disturbances, entry after entry, a litany of nothing. The final page ended half a year ago with a line more tired than the rest. Men die above the ground. The dead below have better manners. Eryndor smiled without humor. He trimmed a candle, set it near the stool, and settled into the slow shape of a life. The first night lasted forever. Nights do that when a man has been humiliated. He feels each second as if it had weight. Eryndor walked until the soles of his boots memorized each crack. He timed his turns to the drip of water in some hidden seam. The sea thudded distantly, a reminder that the world still moved. At odd intervals, the flame of his lantern strained in a draft that came from nowhere he could feel. Toward midnight, he paused at the mural again. The princess, no, the bride, looked past him toward a point the artist had not carved. Her veil fell so convincingly that Eryndor's hand lifted, an old soldier's reflex to free sightlines. Foolish. He let the hand fall and laughed once in his throat at himself. He was resting that same hand on the hilt of his sword when he heard it. A sound like breath caught behind a door. He straightened. The silence jumped, then nothing. The kind of nothing that makes a man hear his own heartbeat. He stepped closer to the sarcophagus, slow, not to startle a rat or his own ghost. The seals were unbroken. The lid lay heavy and unchanged. The lantern threw his shadow long and thin across the lid, so the shadow's head bowed like a penitent's. Wind, he said aloud, to teach the room what to think. Stone, sea. The crypt did not answer. He resumed his rounds. The sound did not return, and if it had only been his mind reaching for company, then he forgave it. The worst thing about punishment is not the task. It is the isolation a just man feels when surrounded by people who call injustice reasonable. In the quiet, the mind brings its own crowd. When dawn came, it did not enter the crypt with light. It announced itself in a gentling of cold, in the smallest drying of the air, in the way the candle flame steadied. Eryndor climbed to the mouth of the stair to take the day like a ration. Sea spray blew in his face. The gulls had returned to their laughing. He thought of the yard at the city barracks, of drills already begun, of men who would be looking around as if a wall had been removed and not replaced. "Keep your posts," he said to the wind. "Keep your oaths." The wind did what it pleased. Days built habit like coral builds reef. Eryndor set a schedule and obeyed it as if it were still printed on the barrack wall. He cut wood from the scrub that had strangled the inner court, dragged it to the keep, and stored it under the stair. He mended a hinge on the inner door with a leather thong. He repaired the watchman's stool when it creaked, because if something is yours, you keep it until it is better than you received it. In the small store he found chalk and marked the wall with neat strokes for each night completed. He wrote in the record of the watch with a larger, heavier hand than the thin script that came before. No disturbances. Candles replenished. Storm scattering on the horizon. On the fourth night, heard a sound like breath. Seals intact. Will not dignify shadows with names. He allowed himself small rituals that did not look like yearning. Each evening, as he lit the ring of sconces around the tomb, he paused one heartbeat, no more, before the mural that showed the iron doors half closed and the bride turned inward. He told himself that a good guard learns the contours of his watch, faces, corners, shapes. He did not admit that the carved suggestion of Seliora's mouth had begun to feel like a sentence she never finished. On the 7th night, the sea dragged a storm against the cliffs and tore at them like a dog. Rain knuckled the battlements. From the lower keep, the world above became rumor, flashes of cold white through the arrow slits, the bang of something loosened and thrown against stone, then the long roar as water curled itself full length on rock. Lightning ran its finger along the fort's bones. Eryndor lanterned the crypt and checked the seals again. The lead glinted, old and stubborn. He touched it with 2 fingers anyway, as a child touches a gate to test whether it still refuses him. The lead was cool. He sat on the stool and let the storm keep time. The tomb had deepened him already. A week of solitude can feel like a year if a man meets himself in it. He thought of the men who had walked before him and written their dutiful, empty lines. He considered sending a letter to one of the magistrates whose conscience might still twitch. He discarded the thought. Letters can be seized, conversations misquoted. If change came, it would come like storms come, without permission. A long, slow hour later, the storm staggered and drew a breath. In that breath, the crypt made a sound. Not breath, not wind in a vent, a name. It was barely a syllable. It could have been the seam in the door groaning. It could have been the sea, playing tricks with the ear. But the hair along Eryndor's forearms lifted and stayed lifted because a man knows the sound of his name even when it shouldn't be possible for anyone to say it. He rose. The lantern light trembled in the glass as if the flame, too, had heard and wanted to run. "Who's there?" he said, and immediately felt foolish for speaking to stone. The answer was not repeated. Still, the feeling of nearness did not go away. It enfolded the sarcophagus like heat one does not see. Eryndor drew closer until his palm rested on the cool lid, and he felt then, not movement, not vibration, but the certainty that something on the far side of that slab had turned its face toward his and listened as he listened. A mirror, dark side to dark side, 2 solitudes peering. He took his hand away. He did not stumble because he was Eryndor, and a captain does not stumble without deciding to. He returned to the wall and wrote nothing because there are events that do not become truer for being inked. The storm lunged back, harder. Somewhere above, a piece of the outer parapet gave up and fell with a crash that shook dust out of the ceiling's joints. Grit sprinkled his shoulders. A hairline crack in one pillar stretched another finger's width, then stopped, as if the stone had sighed. He made his rounds again. He stared at seams in the floor. He found nothing he could hold up to common sense and say, "Here, this is the cause." Common sense sulked in the corner and refused to help. Toward dawn, he climbed the stair and shouldered the door to test the world. It pushed back with the weight of rain. He leaned into it long enough to reassure himself that if he needed to get out, he could. He came down again, slower than he'd gone up. He did not sleep. He allowed his eyes to close while sitting upright, which is not the same thing. By the 12th mark on the chalk wall, his body belonged to the rhythm. He woke when he needed to, ate when the watch permitted, and shaved by the mirror of his knife's back because he refused to become a cave beast. He began to talk aloud some nights, not to the tomb, never to the tomb, but to the routine. Once around, he'd tell the room. Twice to check the vents. Habit makes company. He read the old inscriptions along the crown of the pillars and learned the names of masons who had cut their signatures into the margin. Baron, son of Hale, Petra of the North Gate, Olin, who loved order. He said their names once softly, as if to include them in his rounds. Not prayer, inventory. On the 15th night, a different kind of storm gathered. Not over the sea, over the city. He felt it in the air as a hunter feels weather in bone, pressure without sound, omen without shape. The lantern flame stayed still, and yet he could not shake the sense that a hand he could not see had placed pieces on a board and now considered the next move. He stood before the mural and looked into Seliora's carved eyes, and for the first time allowed the disloyal thought, What sort of men close a door on a bride and call it duty? No answer came, because stone is the last witness to a crime. It tells truth only in the fact of its endurance. The night that followed was quiet until it was not. It began with a sound like the sea withdrawing a long way from shore, as if to show its teeth. Eryndor felt the hair lift again on his arms, but this time it was not his name. It was a tremor in the very air, a tension that set the oil in the lamp to a subtle shiver. He looked up without knowing why, and the chamber looked back at him, the way a wild creature does when it has decided whether to flee or charge. He finished his round. He would not be hurried by a feeling. He set the lamp near the sarcophagus because he refused darkness the last word. He stood with his hands loose at his sides and his weight on the balls of his feet, like a man about to receive an opponent's lunge. He said very quietly, "I am not afraid of you." He meant the crypt. He meant the crown. He meant his own loneliness, which had turned out to be the most dangerous of all three. A breath moved, real as a living throat, closer now. Eryndor did not draw his sword. He had done harder things than draw steel. He had stood at bedsides where men raved and made promises to ghosts. He put his palm on the stone again, not as a challenge this time, but as a pledge. "I am here," he said, and surprised himself by hearing in the words a kindness he offered no one else. "It is my post to keep you. I will keep you." The stone was cool, the air warmed by the smallest fraction, no more than if a candle had been set behind the slab. It should not have been possible for warmth to pass through stone like that. He knew it. He did not correct the knowledge. He allowed both realities to stand and stare at each other. When the hour turned, he lifted the chalk and made his mark upon the wall. He paused, chalk still in hand, and then, because honesty is part of courage, he added beneath the tidy stroke, "Heard my name, heard breath, kept my oath." He laid down the chalk. He looked once more at the mural, at the bride's face turned not toward the viewer, but toward the seam of the closing door. He stood long enough to count his heartbeats to 100, then 200, and in that time, in the quiet place where a man stops performing for himself, the certainty came, as clean and sudden as the feeling that the ground will hold when you step. He was not alone. The dead do not keep company the way the living do. But there are other kinds of company. The kind made of attention. The kind in which two separate silences lean toward one another until they touch. Eryndor bowed his head, not to a sovereign, not to a ghost, but to the truth of what he felt, and then straightened again, the act finished. He resumed his rounds as if he had not just crossed a boundary that most men never notice until it is behind them. Above, the sea continued speaking its language of bruises to the cliff. Below, in stone that had outlived lovers, kings, and courts, a captain kept his post. He did not yet know that the storm gathering inland would break here first. He did not yet know that iron can crack when a single name is spoken through it with enough longing. He knew only this. The next time breath moved in the tomb, he would answer by name. And when a voice, soft and hoarse from centuries, finally said his, he would not reach for his sword. He would reach for his cloak, and he would cover the bride. Night came down like a siege. Clouds marched in ranks from the inland hills, black upon black, until the sky had no seam left for stars. The sea lost its silver and turned the color of hammered lead. Gulls vanished as if a hand had wiped them from the page. In the lower keep, the wind found new throats to sing through. It moaned in arrow slits, whistled in cracks that hadn't existed that morning, and pressed its cold lips to the stair like a warning. Eryndor lit every sconce in the crypt and set fresh oil in the lantern. Flame braided itself along the circle of light, thin, stubborn threads against a room that preferred shadow. The sarcophagus waited in the center, lid smooth as old river stone, the lead seams dull as ash. On the walls, the murals shivered with the dance of the light so that paint seemed to breathe. Seliora's carved veil, which had been nothing but held stone for centuries, looked, for one heartbeat, like fabric moving in a draught. Storm, he told himself, nothing else. But his voice had thickened, made smaller by the air, as if the room preferred that he whisper. Thunder stepped somewhere beyond the cliffs and tested the foundations with a heavy foot. The lantern trembled. A pause. The sound arrived, long, rolling, like a mountain learning to speak. Eryndor walked the perimeter. His rounds were different tonight. They marched to a drum the weather beat. He checked the vents first. Bars firm, masonry sound, tethers unfrayed. He checked the pillars next and found hairline cracks he hadn't seen before, mapping one fluted column in a thin white delta. He touched the lines with a soldier's gentleness, the way he might check fever at a brow, and his fingertips came away gritty with powder. "Not on my watch," he said to the pillar and to himself. "Hold." He moved to the sarcophagus and placed his palm on the edge. Cool stone pressed back. For so many nights, that had been the end of the conversation. Tonight, it was only the opening line. A gust came down the stair as if the fortress had drawn breath to shout. It crashed through the outer door and hit the inner vault, and the vault did what vaults do when pressed past their patience. It answered. Iron somewhere in the hinge guts gave a sound like a broken note. The floor beneath Eryndor's boots flexed, just enough to teach the bones of his feet a new idea of balance. The first drop struck his cheek. He looked up, expecting to see a leak, but the stone overhead was whole. He tasted the drop and found no salt. Not the sea, then. Condensed storm, the air so thick with it that water made itself out of nothing in mid-cold. Lightning detonated beyond the cliff with the white of a god's eye opening. For an instant the arrow slit stood open to daylight. His shadow leapt away from him like a man startled into flight. The follow-on thunder came down the stair as if it had decided the keep, not the sky, was its instrument. In that hanging second after the shock, the room made a new sound. It was not wind, not the patient creak of settling beams. It was the short, stunned pry of lead when it shifts against stone. Eryndor's head snapped to the seal line. The lantern's reflection quivered on the seam like a vein under skin. He went to his knees before he knew he had moved and bent low, the way a man listens at a keyhole when what's on the other side is the rest of his life. Silence. Then, quiet as a pin stroking silk, a breath. His throat tightened. His hand twitched toward his sword. For one heartbeat, instinct demanded steel, demanded distance. Another instinct, the kind born of every ghost story he had ever dismissed, urged him to run. But he forced his hand down. His boots stayed planted. His breath came hard, but he held it steady until fear bent beneath the weight of discipline. He was a captain, and captains do not abandon posts. Another lightning strike. A crack ran audibly along the pillar delta. White chalk line turned to a thin black mouth that swallowed dust. The seam along the sarcophagus answered with a fractional shift. He saw it this time. Lead flexing and then yielding, metal's memory betrayed by stress and storm. Easy, he breathed, to the stone, to himself. Easy. The room tightened around the next sound like a throat around a sob. It came from the far side of the lid, not through vent or hall or trick runnel, but from within. A voice that had not practiced speech in an age tried a single syllable and found it too heavy to lift. It rested, gathered what it had, and tried again. He closed his eyes, as if that would help him hear. The lantern clicked softly as hot glass settled in its frame. His name came up through stone like a plant pushing through a crack in spring. Eryndor. His breath caught. For a moment, the world tilted. Awe and terror flooded through him together, too much for his chest to hold. He almost staggered, almost called on the name of the gods. But he did neither. He forced his knees to stay beneath him, his voice to answer. "I am here," he said, and the words were more than information. They were vow. For a heartbeat, nothing but rain. Then the slow, terrible work of returning announced itself. Not the drama of doors flying open. The world loves theater, but true miracles are often administrative. They are comprised of 1,000 small permissions granted in order: warmth where there was none, breath where breath had been a rumor, a pulse that tries, fails, tries again. The seam surrendered another hair's breadth. The lid shifted, no more than the thickness of a fingernail, and then stalled, as if unsure it had permission to continue. Eryndor slid his cloak onto the cold stone, spreading it like a shield between her and the crypt floor. Then, with trembling hands he could not still, he eased his arms beneath her shoulders. She weighed almost nothing. Too light, like part of her had not returned from the grave. Carefully, disbelieving each heartbeat of it, he lifted her free and laid her upon the cloak. For a moment he only knelt there, staring, unable to decide if he held a miracle or a curse. Then, instinct stronger than doubt, he drew the cloak's edge over her shoulders to guard what warmth she might find. The world tried to tilt. One does not borrow the dead and stand, so he populated the moment with tasks. He took the lantern to the brazier, coaxed flame from coals he had been nursing for this and no other reason, and fed it until heat trembled above the lip. He returned with the lantern, placed it near but not close enough to bite, and then knelt again, measuring the lines of her face for pain as a physician might. Her fingers found his forearm where the greave ended. She touched the scar along his jaw as if she were remembering an old road by feel. "You look different," she said, and the voice had texture now, silk against burlap, human against centuries. "So do you," he said, because humor is a rope across a chasm, and he knew better than to let this moment have only solemnity. She breathed a small laugh that unknotted something in his chest. Then she flinched, not from him, but from the sound of the storm throwing itself against the keep. Her gaze jerked to the door, as if expecting men with torches. "You are safe," he said, "with me." He didn't adorn it. Oaths do not need decoration. Her eyes returned to his. "They sealed me," she said, the word thick with memory. "Why?" He didn't press. He offered her a cup of water, and when she tried to lift it, her hands trembled so that he took it back and steadied it to her mouth. She drank as if the water had a halo. "Because I knew," she said at last. The pendant flashed once, catching lantern light like a star pinned just above her heart. "Because I carried a truth they could not permit. They called it a curse so that men would obey without asking questions." "What truth?" He heard the professional in his voice and softened it. "Tell me what you wish to, only what you can." Her eyes drifted to the murals. "It is in the stone. They made remembrance obedient to their story. But the real story is under it, as the ocean is under light." "You said my name," he said. He had not planned to ask. The question had chosen its own time, and he was too honest to refuse it. She considered him as if weighing coins, not guarding, not yet. She had too little strength to be strategic, but choosing the truest phrase. "Because it has always been yours," she said simply, "in life and in the long place after it." He could have argued. He had a habit of asking the world to show its work. But the world had opened a tomb and laid a bride on his cloak. He let this be another truth that did not require contradiction to prove itself. She raised a hand, as if to test whether he was real, and her fingers found the red sash he still wore from habit, even though it no longer named his rank. She traced the frayed edge, and something like tenderness passed through her face, a recognition of a thing kept beyond its usefulness because it had been earned. "Rest," he said. "You've done enough work for 10 lifetimes." "I have done only waiting," she murmured, but she let her eyes close. He watched the tiny intercession of her breath against the air. The brazier stroked warmth into the frigid stone. The storm stepped back a pace to gather itself and then came on again, but the room no longer felt like a throat about to close. It felt like threshold. He wrote nothing in the record. There are entries that belong to no book. When she slept, he moved to the sarcophagus and, with care, settled the lid back onto the lip so the brace could come away without invitation to accident. He did not reseal the lead. He would not cap a miracle like a jar. He banked the brazier with steady hands and returned to the cloaked figure to check that no ember could leap to cloth. He had done this 100 times for men in tents by winter roads, warmth enough to heal, distance enough to guard. She woke once at a thunderclap with a gasp that belonged to a night centuries ago. He was there with his palm open above her hand without touching it. "It's this storm," he promised. "Not that one." Her gaze sharpened and knew him at once, and the panic ebbed without argument. "Eryndor," she said, and this time the name sounded like water finally finding its riverbed. He should have been empty. Long days, longer nights, the labor of holding a world quiet around a returning life. And yet he was full. Not euphoric. Fullness like a granary, like a city's cistern when the drought breaks and the first rain drums on stone. "Who will come?" he asked softly, because the next thing after a miracle is always the world. If they hear, if they suspect. "Men who keep their crowns by burying truth," she said, already half asleep. "Men who call it mercy to blind a kingdom." He listened after she slept and heard, beneath storm and sea, a different sound. Horses at distance, hooves muffled on soaked earth, the faint clink of tack. Not on the stair, not yet, but approaching. He climbed to the outer door and pushed it enough to peer through the crack. On the far ridge beyond the headland, a rag of light moved, then another. Torches. Eryndor let the door ease shut. He stood a moment in the half-dark of the stair and let the facts array themselves in the order a life could follow. The king's sentence, the crypt, the voice, the name, the woman asleep on his cloak, the torches on the ridge. He went down into the tomb and set his hand lightly on the hilt of his sword, not the way one reaches for violence, but the way a craftsman lays fingers on his tools before work. He checked the brazier. He checked her breathing. He moved the lantern so that the light would fall first on him if the door opened, and only then on her. "I am here," he said again, to the room, to the woman, to the wind that ran messages faster than couriers. "This is my post." Above, thunder argued with the cliff. Below, heat feathered into cold. Between the two, a captain and a bride waited for the first footfall on the stair. The storm did not end. It only learned to pace itself. By dawn, the sea was a gray beast, breathing slow against the cliffs. Rain clung to the fortress stones in rivulets, dropping now and then from the arrow slits, with a sound like the counting of time. In the crypt, Seliora slept on Eryndor's cloak. Her breathing was shallow but steady, the rise and fall of someone who had not dreamed in centuries and now borrowed the rhythm from the living world. Eryndor had not slept. His body knew how to steal moments of rest, the soldier's way, eyes closed, half an hour stolen. But he did not trust himself to drift while the sound of hooves on the ridge still haunted him. So he had sat by the brazier, sword across his knees, watching her. When she stirred, it was with the faintest rustle, as if stone dust itself sighed. Her eyes opened, pale blue caught between frost and flame. For an instant she looked past him, seeing walls that were not there anymore. Then her gaze found his, and the weight of the centuries dropped away like shackles. "You are still here," she whispered. "I gave my word," Eryndor said, her lips curved, fragile as the first thaw. "They punished you. They always punish the ones who speak." He tilted his head. "What do you mean?" She pushed herself to sit, the cloak falling from her shoulders. Her strength was uneven. She swayed, and he steadied her with a hand on her back. The contact jolted him. It should not have been warm, but it was. Faint, fragile, like embers buried under ash. "They said I was cursed," Seliora murmured. "That to bury me was to protect the kingdom. But the curse was only a name they gave to their fear." Her hand rose to the pendant at her throat. The tarnished metal caught the brazier's glow. This was the truth they sought to hide. Eryndor frowned. "What is it?" "A key," she whispered, "to a relic that should never have been forged. My blood could wake it, my life could bind it, so they bound me here instead." Her eyes drifted to the murals. They told the people I died of fever. They buried the story beneath flowers and lies. He followed her gaze to the carving of her procession, halted before the iron doors. Now, in her presence, the mural seemed wrong. It had always looked like sorrow. Now it looked like betrayal. "And the king knows of this relic?" Eryndor asked. "He is of their blood," she said bitterly. "He knows. He seeks it still." A sound pricked his ear, the faint scrape of stone above, deliberate, not storm or sea. Eryndor rose silently, crossing to the stair. He heard the muffled thud of boots, the metallic ring of armor, voices carried low, cautious. He returned quickly to her side. "Soldiers," he said. Her face blanched, the fragile warmth draining from her skin. "They will not let me walk free. They will not let you stand with me." Eryndor looked at her, really looked. At the bruised nobility in her eyes, the centuries of silence laid upon her, the way she had spoken his name with no hesitation. Something moved in him then. Not duty, not rebellion, but something older and stronger. "They'll have to go through me first," he said. She touched his hand where it gripped the sword. "They will call you traitor." "They already have," he said. His voice was steady, but his heart thundered like the storm outside. The door above groaned open. Footsteps began the descent. The glow of torches flickered against the stone. Eryndor guided Seliora back toward the shadow of the pillar, where the brazier's light would not reach her. He took his place before the sarcophagus, sword drawn, not lifted, not yet, but angled low, a warning waiting for provocation. The first soldier appeared on the stair, shield strapped, torch in hand. Another followed, and another. The narrow stair funneled them one by one into the chamber, but soon 5 stood in the crypt, their faces hard beneath the shifting light. Their leader stepped forward, the plume of his helm wet with rain. "Captain Eryndor." His voice carried both respect and mockery, the balance of a man who had once served beneath him. "By the king's order, you are relieved. Stand down." Eryndor did not move. "The tomb remains under my watch." The soldier's eyes narrowed. "You speak as if it is your choice. There are whispers in the court already. They say the dead walk, that a curse stirs. The king has ordered the seal renewed. Whatever lies within," he gestured toward the sarcophagus, "must remain there." Eryndor felt Seliora's presence at his back, not touching, but near enough that he sensed the weight of her silence. His grip tightened on the sword. "What lies within," he said evenly, "is not yours to bind again." A ripple went through the men. Some shifted uneasily, as if hearing conviction they had not expected. But the leader sneered. "You stand against your own, against crown and oath." "I stand where my oath began," Eryndor said. "With truth, with the people this crown has long forgotten, and with her." At the last words, Seliora stepped from the shadow. The soldiers froze. She was pale as moonlight, her ruined gown trailing across the floor, her eyes luminous with something no torch could counterfeit. One soldier dropped his torch in shock. Another whispered a prayer. The leader snarled, "Abomination!" His blade hissed from its sheath. Eryndor raised his sword at last. "Bride," he said, his voice iron, "stay behind me." Seliora's voice, clear and cold, cut through the chamber. "No, I will not hide again." The brazier's flame surged as if drawn to her words. Shadows clawed the walls. The pendant at her throat pulsed once, faint but real, like a heartbeat echoed in metal. The soldiers shifted, torn between fear and command. The leader barked, "Seize her!" Steel rang as they advanced. Eryndor stepped forward to meet them, his blade flashing in the firelight. The first clash echoed like thunder within the crypt. Behind him, Seliora lifted her head. For the first time in centuries, she stood not as a prisoner, not as a sacrifice, but as herself. And the tomb itself seemed to listen. The crypt erupted in steel and shadow. The first soldier lunged with a shout, blade thrusting for Eryndor's chest. He met the strike with a turn of his wrist, sparks spitting as iron screamed on iron. The impact rattled his shoulder, but he drove forward, shieldless, using his body as weight. The man staggered back, torchlight flaring across his helm. Two more surged past, angling for Seliora. "No!" Eryndor roared, pivoting to block. His sword swept wide, a silver arc in the brazier's glow. The first blow caught a soldier's spear haft and split it in half. The second caught the man's gauntlet, knocking the weapon free. Behind him, Seliora's pendant pulsed again, bright enough that shadows bent toward her as if compelled. Her breath came fast, the sound sharp in the chamber. She was trembling, but her voice cut steady through the chaos. "I will not go back to stone." The soldiers faltered, unnerved by her words, but their leader snarled, rallying them with fury. "Seize them both!" Eryndor met him head-on. Their swords collided, the force of it running up his arms like thunder in bone. The man was strong, trained, young, loyal to the wrong master, but strength alone was not enough. Eryndor had been captain for a reason. He fought like a man who had defended gates, streets, and the lives of those who never knew his name. Each strike was calculated, each parry tight, no wasted motion. Yet for every soldier he drove back, another pressed in. Their numbers threatened to bury him by sheer weight. Seliora stepped forward, raising her hand. The pendant blazed once, a searing flash that filled the crypt like lightning. Murals shivered, and the carved lilies seemed to bow as if in wind. The soldiers cried out, some staggering, one dropping his sword entirely. Eryndor glanced back at her, breath ragged. "Stay behind me." Her eyes met his, luminous and defiant. "I was buried for obedience. I will not live in it." She came to his side, fingers brushing his arm. The touch steadied him in ways no shield could. For one moment, in the storm of blades and firelight, they stood not as guard and prisoner, not as captain and ghost, but as two bound by something older than fate. Their leader lunged again, sword raised high. Eryndor caught the blade, steel screaming, and leaned close enough that sweat and stormlight burned in his eyes. "This is not your fight," Eryndor growled. The man spat, straining. "It is the king's will." Eryndor shoved him back. "Then your king is a coward who fears the truth he buried." The leader reeled, but another soldier came at Eryndor's side. Eryndor barely turned the blow. His arm ached, muscles screaming, but Seliora was there, her hand gripping his cloak, her voice a whisper only for him. "Eryndor, you are the same." He froze for a heartbeat, parrying blind. "The same. The same man who stood beside me centuries ago," she said, voice breaking with memory. "The one I was meant to marry. They stole you from me then, but you came back." The truth hit him harder than any blade. It explained everything, the pull he felt toward her name, the way her voice saying his had rung like memory. He was not just her guard. He had been her betrothed, reborn into another age, punished again for his loyalty. "Seliora," he whispered, chest burning. She smiled through tears, and for a moment, the storm, the soldiers, the tomb, none of it mattered. Only them. The leader saw his chance and charged. Eryndor whirled, fury lending him strength. His blade caught the man's mid-swing, twisted, and slammed the pommel into his helm. The leader crashed to the ground, dazed. "Hold!" one soldier shouted, fear quivering in his voice. The men hesitated, caught between orders and terror. That was when the crypt itself answered. The pendant's glow leapt from Seliora's throat to the murals. The painted doors cracked. The stone lilies split and turned to dust. From the sarcophagus behind them, a deep groan rose, as though the relic sealed within had heard the commotion and stirred. Seliora's eyes widened, her hand clutching the pendant. "It's waking!" "What is it?" Eryndor demanded, holding his sword ready. "The relic," she whispered. "The crown they forged from fallen stars. It drinks blood. It rules not by right, but by fear." The soldiers gasped, some crossing themselves. One backed toward the stair. Eryndor turned to them, voice sharp. "You hear her? This is the truth your king fears. If you bury her again, you bury yourselves with it." But the leader struggled to his feet, bleeding at the brow. "Lies! She is a witch. Strike her down." The men hesitated. One raised his sword half-heartedly, another lowered his entirely. Eryndor pressed forward, blade leveled. "You know me. I led you in battle. I bled with you. Look at her. Does she look like a curse? Or does she look like a woman robbed of her life?" Seliora stepped forward, standing beside him. Her fingers slipped into his, lacing their hands. The glow of the pendant softened, no longer violent but warm, like dawn cresting the sea. The soldiers faltered, shaken. The leader screamed, desperate, and rushed them both. Eryndor caught him head-on. The clash rang like a bell tolling in the crypt. They struggled, blades grinding, sparks flying. The man pushed hard, but Eryndor's strength came not only from muscle. It came from the vow he had made, from the woman standing beside him, from the love that had spanned lifetimes. With a roar, he twisted the man's sword aside and drove his own hilt into the breastplate, sending him sprawling. Silence fell, broken only by the storm above and the crackling brazier. The soldiers looked at their fallen leader, then at Eryndor and Seliora. None moved to attack. One knelt, head bowed. Another dropped his sword entirely. The relic's groan faded, sealed again by Seliora's steady grip on the pendant. Her hand shook, but she held fast. "It will sleep," she whispered, "so long as we live free." Eryndor wrapped his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. She leaned into him, exhaustion heavy, but her smile trembled with relief. The soldiers retreated one by one, leaving their leader groaning on the stone. None dared lift their weapons again. The stair swallowed their torches until only darkness and rain remained. Eryndor exhaled, pulling Seliora fully into his arms. For the first time in centuries, she rested her head against a living chest. His cheek pressed to her hair, damp with dust and storm, and he closed his eyes. "You are mine," he murmured, "in this life, in every life." Her answer came soft but unshakable. "And I am yours. No crown, no tomb, no curse will part us again." They stayed like that, amid ruins and shadows, until the brazier burned low. At dawn, they walked from the crypt together, hand in hand. The storm had broken, leaving the cliffs washed clean, the sea gleaming like polished steel. To the world, they were fugitives. To each other, they were the only truth that mattered. And as the sun broke across the horizon, touching her pale skin with living light, Seliora whispered the words he had waited his whole life to hear. "Eryndor, we are free." If you like this story, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps this channel grow. Thanks for watching.